Okay, so our last contribution paper is by Valentina Cuccio from the University of Palermo, Embodied simulation and mental representations. So 30 minutes for presentation and 10 for discussion.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank the organizer of this very interesting conference for having me here. It's really a pleasure for me. And I want to thank all of you for being here and listen to the very last paper, so late. And in my presentation, I will not directly discuss Professor Baker's work, but I hope I can still contribute to the debate about the first person perspective in some way. Okay, so let's start. My presentation, I will talk about the notion of mental representation in relation to the process of embodied simulation. So here is an outline of my talk. I will have in the first part of the talk, I will draft the background of my presentation. That is, I will very brief talk about the discovery of mirror neurons and the role that this discovery had in the growth of embodied cognition studies. I will then discuss a particular notion of mental representations in bodily format that was recently proposed by Alvin Goldman and Frédéric de Vignemont, and that was then adopted by Vittorio Gallese to define the mechanism of embodied simulation. So I will try to provide you some objections to this definition. And in the very last part of the paper, I will try to give you an alternative definition for the mechanism of embodied simulation that will be defined as a kind of as a brain and a bodily resonance, as a form of attunement between persons. So Vittorio Gallese also uses this term resonance, but I will use it in a different way, and I will try to explain what's the difference between my usage and his usage. Okay, so sorry, we already have. Okay, so let's start with the background. The people you can see in the pictures are the people that work in Parma, the University of Parma, and are part of the research group that discovered mirror neurons. So Giacomo Rizzolatti, that is the leader of this research group, and Vittorio Gallese and Leonardo Fogassi. I was so lucky to have the opportunity to work with them for 1 year in 2012. Okay, so they discovered mirror neurons in 1992, first in the brain of the macaque monkey, and a few years later they discovered mirror neurons also in the human brain. But what mirror neurons are? Maybe you already know the answer to this question, so I will be very quick. Mirror neurons are multimodal neurons in the premotor cortex. What does it mean? It means that these neurons respond to different kind of stimuli. So, for example, these neurons in the motor cortex fire both when we are actively carrying out an action, for example, when we are kicking a ball, or just when we see someone else, like this football player in the picture, kicking a ball. So for this reason, this class of neurons were qualified as having mirror properties because of these particular features that they have. So at the beginning, so Rizzolatti, Gallese, and so on, we're talking about mirror neurons. A few years later, they start to talk about a mirror mechanism, because they discovered that mirror neurons are not just because they discovered that this class of neurons were not just localized in the motor cortex of the brain, but that they were, widespread in the brain. There is a typo here, so don't look at the question mark. It's not a question, it's a claim. So the mirror mechanism is a widespread mechanism in the brain. So this mirror properties does not qualify only the neurons in the motor cortex, but also in other areas of the brain, for example, areas that control emotions, perception, and so on and so forth. Okay. And in the last years, it has been suggested by many empirical studies that mirror neurons are involved in social cognition, for example, in action understanding, in conceptual processing, in mental imagery, and in language. So, Vittorio Gallese and Corrado Sinigallia in 2011 in a very nice paper, proposed to define this phenomenon of the simulation in the brain as embodied simulation. This was a more general definition that, like an umbrella definition, that covers all the occurrences of this phenomenon. So not only the motor simulation in the brain, but also in all the other areas of the brain, and also related not only to mirror neurons, but also to another class of neurons that was lately discovered, the so-called canonical neurons, that also can produce this kind of simulation. For example, when I look at an object such as a bottle, just by looking at the bottle, the motor neurons in my brain that allow me to shape my hand in a way that fits the bottle will be activated. So this is another occurrence of the phenomenon of simulation. And they call embodied simulation all these different occurrences of this phenomenon. Okay. So, the next point I want to address is what is the role of mirror neurons in the embodied cognition debate. So, no doubt, really without doubts, the discovery of mirror neurons has significantly contributed to the growth of the embodied cognition studies in these last years. But what is embodied cognition? The answer to this question is not so easy, because embodied cognition is not a unitary research field. There are really many accounts of embodied cognition. So maybe we can try to identify some defining feature of this account. There are few features that they share. So we can say that all the account or embodied cognition accounts in some way reject the computational and representational theory of mind, and also they claim that cognitive processes rely on perception systems and action systems. So really are really deeply grounded in our bodies. Okay, so as I said, embodied cognition is not a unitary research field. We can try to find some demarcation line in this research field. One of these demarcation line is the notion of representation that allows us to make a distinction between radical embodied theorists that are those who deny any explicative role to the notion of representation in human cognition. So, for example, all these people that you can see quoted in the first, in the radical paragraph, are people, for example, that endorse dynamical system theory. On the other hand, we have moderate embodied theories that accept both representational, I don't know what's going on, that accept both representational and not representational explanation of human conditions. So they use both, they are kind of hybrid theories in this sense. They accept the notion of representation, but sometimes they try to explain human cognition without resorting to this notion. There is also another distinction we can make in this debate between strong and weak embodiment. This distinction was proposed by Smith and Vignemont in 2012. So they talk about strong embodied theories that are those that give a clear explanatory role to the body, directly to the body. And there are, on the other hand, weak embodied theories that do not give a direct explanatory role to the body, but to the representation of the body. And these two distinctions, I want to stress this point. I mean, this one by Smith and Vignemont, and the other one I showed you before that was proposed by Henry Clark. I mean, these two distinctions do not overlap. So, for example, you can be a strong embodied theorist and claim that the body has a direct role in human cognition, but at the same time you can admit that we also have explanation of the human cognition that use representations, mental representation. Okay, so these two distinctions do not overlap. So it seems so far that there are at least a couple of very problematic issues in the embodied cognition debate. That are the notion of representation. Do we need it, or don't we need it? And the other problematic issue is the role of the body. What kind of role does the body play? It is a direct role, or it is mediated by a representation? So I will now turn to the second part of my talk. And I will discuss the notion of mental representation in bodily format related to this mechanism of embodied simulation. But let's try first to define what is a mental representation in bodily format. As I told you, Gallese and Sinigaya adopted this definition of mental representation in bodily format, but the definition was proposed by Alvin Goldman and Frédéric de Vignemont in 2009. So I tried here to give you a definition of what a mental representation in bodily format is. But to be honest, in the paper they never give a clear definition. I would say that they never give a real definition of what a mental representation in bodily format is. And of course this leaves open many problematic aspects for the discussion. So I want to stress this problematic aspect. So mainly they say that when we have this kind of simulation in the brain, so I see someone else grasping a bottle in this way, and I have a motor simulation running in my brain. So even if I'm not moving, I'm not grasping the bottle myself, I have the same motor areas of my brain activated. Okay? So they say that when we have this simulation running in our brain, this is the occurrence of a mental representation. And what characterizes the mental representation is the fact that it has a bodily format. So they then talk a lot about what the bodily format is. And the bodily format, for example, in the example I just gave you, is motoric. When I have a simulation of the action carried out by someone else, I can have, for example, a mental representation in an affective format, if I have a motor simulation related to the emotion that I can see in the face of the other person, and so on and so forth. Okay, so this is what characterizes the bodily format. The areas, I mean, basically the area of the brain where the simulation is going on. But I think that this definition that they give is controversial. And I think that we can provide objections to this definition. They don't want to be. It's Alvin Goldman that is like sending. So I think that we can provide objections to this definition. But this is important is I mean to deny the fact that the mechanism of simulation is a representation, the occurrence of a mental representation does not equal to say that we do not need the notion of representation to explain how human cognition works. Okay, I don't want to make such a claim. My claim is just when we look at the phenomenon of embodied simulation, this phenomenon is not a representation, and I mean the definition of mental representation in bodily format does not really work. Okay, these are my claims. And I think that at least we can give two objections to this notion of mental representation in bodily format. I think that the first of these objections rely on the definition of what a representation is, and rely on what are the minimal criteria to define something a representation. So I think that at least to define something as a representation, we should be able to identify in what the representation is. We should be able to identify a content and the format or modality of representation. So this is the first point. I think we cannot do this with the notion of mental representation in bodily format, and I will tell you why. And the other objection is about the lack, again, of a distinction. The distinction between the putative information that should be conveyed by this representation and the role that those neurons that constitute the format of the representation play in the brain. So I will tell you more in a minute. Let me start first with the content and format distinction. So we can say that in the definition that they are giving us, the fact that we have some neurons, for example, firing in the motor cortex when we observe someone else performing an action, constitute, in their definition, the format of the representation. Okay, but at the same time, I think we are allowed to say that the very fact that the neuron is firing represent, if we can talk about information at this level, represent a bit of information. So it is at the same time the content of this representation and its format. So I think that we can really not make the distinction between content and format of representation in this case. They completely overlap. Let's look at the second distinction between role and information. What do I mean here? So let's think again at the case of motor simulation. I see someone else, okay, performing an action, grasping a bottle, and I have the motor simulation running in my brain. What happens is that at some point there is an inhibition mechanism that intervenes and that prevent me to parrot all the action that I see. There is an inhibition mechanism that stops the chain, okay, the neural chain, the neural sequence, preventing us to just do everything we see other people are doing, okay? And there are cases in which this inhibition mechanism does not work. In this case, in this case, we have patients that echopractic patients. So we have persons with a problem, persons that are not able to refrain, to imitate everything that they see. And we also know that the mirror neuron system is involved in automatic imitation. Okay, so this means that what those neurons are doing in the brain is exactly what they really do when they are involved in a real action. Okay, it's just that at some point this process is interrupted because of this inhibition mechanism. Okay, so we cannot really make a distinction between the role that those neurons usually have and the information they should represent. This is not possible. So what then? What about simulation then? And we are now at the third part of my talk. So the fact that embodied simulation cannot be considered as a mental representation equals to say that it is not a relevant phenomenon, it is not a necessary process for human cognition. I don't want to make such a claim. I think that embodied simulation is a very important mechanism. This mechanism is constitutive of many cognitive functions, such as language understanding and action understanding and so on and so forth. But, so we need to, at this point, we need to define it in a different way to really understand the role that embodied simulation plays in human cognition. So, and the definition that I will try to provide you is in terms of a kind of attunement that embodied simulation makes possible between ourselves and other people. What does it mean? I think that embodied simulation is a bottom-up process in which we start to carry out some of our cognitive tasks by attuning our brain and body to the situation we need to face. And the body, the part of regarding the body is involved here because I think that the definition that of simulation, embodied simulation that has been provided so far, just look at what happens in the brain. The definition that I would like to provide puts together the brain and the body. So you cannot rule out one of these parts to really make sense of what embodied simulation is. And I think that if we buy into this definition I'm proposing, we can say that the body really has a direct role in human cognition. So, of course, I mean, when we have the phenomenon of the mechanism of simulation running in our brain, we are not aware of the activation of some neurons in the brain. We are never aware of this. But, and this is the central point about my definition, the mechanism of simulation comes also with a kind of bodily feelings. What does it mean? It means that when, so the most clear examples I think I can provide is the one related to the simulation of emotions. So maybe this is an experience you all have had. Sometimes when we see someone else suffering, the person that has had an accident, for example, we cannot look at that situation because it's like if we are suffering ourselves, we really have like a feeling of pain in our body. Okay, so this is when emotions are involved, this mechanism of simulation is in some way amplified. But this is what usually happens. So when I have the mechanism of simulation so when I have the activation of these neurons in my brain, I also have with this activation a kind of bodily feeling, a bodily sensation, okay? And this bodily sensation is what explain this attunement between us and other people. Okay, this is the key point about the definition that I want to provide you. And there are studies like this one by Fadiga and colleagues that was proposed in 1995 that show this. So very briefly, we can say that so far the definition of simulation that we had were mainly brain-centered. My definition is brain and bodily centered, so we cannot miss one of these parts. I think that also very briefly, if we define the embodied simulation in this way, the mechanism of simulation becomes the link between the personal and subpersonal level of explanation of human cognition. Because, of course, we are never aware of the activation of some human neurons in our brain, but we are in some way, and in principle, we can be aware of the feelings in our body, okay? Just to conclude, I think we'll be on time. Let's go to the conclusion. So we can say that, if you buy into the definition I was proposing, we can say that the body has a direct role in human cognition. We do not need to mediate it by means of a representation. We can say that embodied simulation is not a mental representation. We can say that embodied simulation is at the border between personal and subpersonal phenomena. This point regards language, so I was supposed to speak more about language. I didn't do that, so I will skip this passage. And last but not least, this account I think force us to reflect more on the relation between the first person perspective and the second person perspective. Between this, because the approach I proposed here, the embodied simulation is a second person approach to the others that is involved in how in language is involved in the process of learning a language, for example. So I want to leave you not with a conclusion, but maybe with questions. The question is, to what extent the first-person perspective, at least a robust first-person perspective, rely on a second-person perspective. Thank you.
Thank you, Valentina. We have 10 minutes for discussion. Roberta, Mario.
Thank you, Valentina, for this very brilliant presentation the last time of our conference. Just a question. If I have understood, so you tend to define embodied simulation in the class of, to be in the class of the brain and body-centered theories. Okay. Now, as you said, for example, we are some time carrying out interaction with our bodies and brains. Okay, I do understand what it means that I'm carrying out some sort of interaction with my body, like so or like so. I have no idea what it means that I'm carrying out a sort of interaction with my brain.
So you mean interaction?
No, I tried to sum up. I mean, you used a more specific expression, but you said at a certain point, we are carrying out I don't know what with our brain and bodies, with our modifying something, with our...
Maybe I was saying that by means of this... Sorry. Maybe I was saying that by means of this mechanism we get attuned to the others, not only at the personal level but also at the subpersonal level. So we have a kind of resonance with the other that is played.
No doubt about it, no doubt about it. Something of this kind is happening. But you also said we are, so to speak, taking a relation to our body and to our brain. We are modifying something. We are, so maybe it was just a way of express, or just a way of wording the thing without any relevant content. But if you speak of us doing things, then at a personal level, I do understand what it means that my body is modified, and I feel it modified by feeling, for example, sentiments of some sort, or rather feelings of some sort, okay? But I have no idea of what you mean by saying that my brain is modified. I mean, of course, it must be something which is completely separate, not accessible to me.
Yes. So, I'm sorry, maybe I was not clear on this point, because one of the last slides I presented stated exactly this. We are never aware of the activation of a part of our brain. We cannot be aware of that. In principle, we can never be aware of the activation of some neurons in our brain. So I didn't want to say this, and if I let you maybe understand this, I was not making myself clear. My point is, the point was that this mechanism, but I mean, we have. I think that what is interesting about this definition of embodied simulation is that this definition allows us to take together both the subpersonal level of explanation and the personal level of explanation. So what we are aware of is always the personal level, the level of the person, the level of the body, the level of the feelings. We are never aware of the subpersonal level, of the subpersonal mechanism. So we are never aware of neurons firing.
That was exactly the point, because that was the reason why I didn't understand the conjunction brain and body. I mean, that body of which we are constantly aware of is, I mean, that body. So but maybe, in conjunction with brain is a completely different body. I don't know.
Well, my point was that at the same time, both these phenomena are running in our, are taking place in us. So if we look at the personal, if we look at the subpersonal level, we can look at the neural level and the activation of the neurons in the brain. But we are not aware of this. And my point was, what I wanted to stress was that if we define embodied simulation only as a neural fact, we can never make clear, we can never understand what its role is in human cognition. But so far, embodied simulation has always been defined at the brain level. So my point was, we need to add the body level, otherwise we cannot really understand what embodied simulation is doing.
Thank you. I liked the presentation very much. And one point that seems, one little argument in your support, that this phenomenon at the boundary between personal and subpersonal levels is the fact that we sympathize with people on the screen or at the theater when we know that they don't that they don't suffer really. But whereas this identification we have with them is inexplicable if we only stay at the higher level, right? Because we know they are not real.
Yes, but sorry.
The last good point is connected with that. What is the connection between this phenomenon of embodied cognition and empathy?
Okay.
There seems to be very much.
Okay, so about the first point that is of course related and connected to your second point. So this definition allows us to put together both the subpersonal and the personal level. If we look at what happens at the personal, subpersonal level, we are describing a process that is automatic, not reflexive, very fast. So we are describing a bottom-up process that starts in this way like an automatic mechanism, and then, I mean, it becomes also a bodily experience, and so a personal experience, even if it is not, we cannot explain it in rational terms.
You cannot explain it top down. It's unexplainable if you take that route, of course. You know that they don't exist. I agree.
The other point is about empathy, and of course this is related to this point. It has been suggested, it has been claimed that this mechanism is in some way constitutive of our empathic attitude to the others. And I quite agree with this claim, of course, but I think that this is not the whole story, because there are other things that can explain how and why we are, for example, empathic with some person and we are not empathic with other person. So, for example, there are some nice studies that show that, of course, we are empathic. We are more empathic with persons that are closer to us on a cultural level, that are closer to us for many different reasons. Respect to persons that are not close to us. So this is a mechanism that, is not the whole story about empathy. So there are also, I think that we have a bottom-up process and up-down processes at the same, top-down processes at the same time.
Any other questions?
And maybe just a conceptual clarification or question about some term you used. We are not aware of our neural activities, you were saying, and I wonder what this means, because in a way we are of course aware of our neural activities. If I do a calculation in my head, or if I focus on memory, then I am aware that there are neural activities in my head, or I'm aware of the consequences, or not just of the consequences. These brain or these mental processes are, in a way, neural activities. So,
okay,
but in a way, I'm aware of them. Or if you want to have another way of being aware of neural activities, there are image-giving procedures with the help of which you can see that some part of the brain is activated when you think of whatever, or when you do a calculation and so on. So in a way you can see on the monitor of such a machine that there are neural activities going on in your head while you are doing something. So of course you can have this kind of evidence of your neural activities. But of course you cannot see your neurons firing in a direct way, because they are much too small and so on. So
even if they're aware.
What does you mean by we are not aware of our neural activities, that we cannot see our neurons?
So we can never be aware of, so you gave the example of the brain imaging technique, so we can look at the screen and see our neurons firing. This is, of course, yes, in some way we are looking, so we are aware of this activation. But this is, I think, a third-person perspective. It's not, so we are never aware of neurons firing if we are in the sense of the first person epistemic access to this firing of neurons. So I really do not have any idea. And that another point is, so you said we are aware of the fact that our cognitive abilities are related to neurons firing. So you can say this, and maybe you are endorsing an eliminativist theory, but at this point you cannot use the term process, the term, I don't know, mental states, the term representation. You should provide me an explanation that does not use these terms anymore, I think, if you want to eliminate them.
Could be a reductionist, actually. So, an identity theory. But the point is epistemological, of course, not ontological.
Any other questions? Any other questions? No. Okay, so we can thank Valentina.